We hear a lot today in modernity, especially in the United States of America and in the West, about freedom. I have the freedom of speech, I have the freedom to express myself, the freedom to this or that thing. And a lot of times there are questions about the limitations of that freedom. So where's the end or where's the border of the freedom of speech, for example? Can I truly say anything? Well, what if I told you that the definition of freedom, the understanding that was used in the writing of the American Constitution and in the French Constitution, by the way, was not accurate? What if I told you that it didn't match up with the definition of freedom we get from thinkers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, or from the Catechism of the Catholic Church? Today we're going to take a look at law and freedom, how they interact with each other, and the correct definitions of both. Let's start with the first one, law. Law, according to your Catechism, 1951, is an ordination of reason towards the good. An ordination of reason by a competent authority towards the good. See, freedom may be the more exciting of the two concepts, and we really want to get to understanding what freedom is, but without an understanding of what the law is, then we have a deficient understanding of freedom. They're related to each other in an important way, and in a way that you might not expect. So an ordination of God's reason towards the good, that's law itself. It's not an expression of some divine will, but an expression of divine reason. It's not just that God chose X, Y, or Z to be sinful. It's not like he woke up one morning and thought, yeah, I really don't like theft. I'm going to put that on. It's not vulnerable to the Euthyphro dilemma for that reason, if you know the Euthyphro dilemma from your philosophy classes. It's not an arbitrary expression of God's will. The law is a reflection of God's reason. The law is God's reason. And I'm speaking extremely broadly here. Let's talk about the law in its more specific aspects. And again, if there is a God, if we're right about this whole Christian thing, if there really is a creator God who's in charge providentially of all things, then there's only one law. So there aren't different kinds of law. But we might read the law, we might understand the law of the universe in three different aspects. First, there is the eternal law. The eternal law is God's governance of all things in his reason and his power. So the eternal law is everything. If we had perfect access to the eternal law, then we would have perfect knowledge. But we don't. Nevertheless, it's important to establish that there is the existence of such a thing, because without it, God would not be powerful, God would not be the creator, God would not have providential direction over his creation. So the eternal law is God's rule over all things. The natural law, you can think of this as kind of going down. So they're not three different laws, but the natural law is a subset of eternal law. The natural law, you can read this in your Catechism 1954, the natural law is what human reason has access to on its own, unaided by revelation. So the scenario I usually use with my classes is if I took 20 boys and 20 girls, dropped them onto an island somewhere in the Pacific Ocean and said, I'll see you later, and I somehow was able to use like a machine to eliminate all of their moral sense, all of their religious upbringing, would they figure anything out about how to live with one another? Would they figure something out about morality? Would they discover that, oh, hey, I took his coconut and then he took mine. I didn't like that. So maybe we should establish something between us where we don't take each other's coconuts. Or would they be able to look at a human being and reason, hey, that's a lot different than a fish. So I shouldn't eat a human being, but I can eat a fish. Would we be able to figure some of that out? The answer is yes. And all that would be accessible in the one eternal law to us by reason is the natural law. The first principle of the natural law is do good and avoid evil. And there's no one on earth in whom you will not find such a proclivity. You'll find lots of different expressions of what good and evil look like, because we all have different abilities to apprehend on our own without any commandments, without divine revelation. We all have different abilities to apprehend good and evil, but you'll never find someone who does evil as such. That's a contentious proposition. I don't have time to go down that rabbit hole right now, but even a madman, even a wicked person does what they're doing because they think that it's good. The mad killer kills because he thinks the world would be better off without these people. The awful thief, the extortioner, the abortionist, they do their work not because they think that it is pure evil, there's no such thing, but because they're pursuing a good. They're just quite wrong about it. So we all have that inherent instinct, no matter what our IQ is, no matter what our upbringing or culture is, we all have that instinct. The good is that which is to be done, the bad is that which is to be avoided. That's like a little piece of the eternal law planted in the rational mind of every person. And then, is there part of that we can make even more explicit? Yes, the third aspect of law is called positive law. Positive law is law which is posited, law which is offered. And that is what you might think of as human law. Those are the laws that we, through tradition or through actual writing down in legal code, we make explicit in our societies. Now, you'll notice that these things all, I've said multiple times, are all part of the same law. They're all aspects of the same rational governance towards the good. So you might be thinking, well, I live in a country where I don't agree at all with all the positive laws that are made. So what is that? Well, this isn't an exact quotation. I don't have it in front of me, but Augustine famously said, a law that does not follow right reason is not a law. A law that's not rational is not a law. How can that be? So does that mean we're all supposed to become revolutionaries? No, not at all. It means while we default to submission to the authorities, right? St. Paul reminds us of that. St. Thomas Aquinas also says our default position should be to defer to the authorities that are in power over us. So if I'm driving down the road and it says 45 miles an hour, I shouldn't be like, I think more 60 is what I'm going to say is right reason and, put the pedal to the metal. No. But it means that if a law genuinely contradicts reason, if a law genuinely contradicts the truth that my governor puts in place, that my president puts in place, that my king puts in place, then it is not a law at all. So the question of, should I ever defy a law if the law is really evil, is actually a moot point. You can't defy a law that is evil because there aren't any laws that are evil. Kind of shocking, isn't it? I like to use the following analogy. Imagine that I had to go out of the room for something, and I left my detention pad with another student that I really trusted. And I said, now, I put my power into your hands. Do what I would do. If I walk out of the room and I come back and everybody in the room's got a detention, especially this one kid who my regent detention holder really disliked, like he stacked like 20 detentions on this one kid's desk. Would those detentions be valid? Am I going to honor those as actual reasonable detentions? No, I'm going to throw them out because he did what I wouldn't have done. He was supposed to be acting in my stead, but he wasn't. He acted contrary to what I would have done. Well, the secular rulers that God has put in place, they're not just random. They don't just pop up. God's not up there biting his nails at every American election going, oh, gee, I hope the right one gets it. I mean, come on. God is in control of all these things. So that means the authorities that are put into place have rational power to be over us. They're placed there by God, even if they're very, very wicked. However, the dictates of a wicked person, the dictates of a tyrant, the laws that are passed by a tyrant that are contrary to right reason, they're not laws for the same reason that my kid giving detentions out just to whoever he felt like weren't real detentions. They aren't in accord with what I would have done. And I am the authoritative law maker in that situation. And so my students have to follow that if they want to be my governors. It's the same way with our civil authorities. The book of Romans reminds us that we are to submit to the civil authorities by default. They don't bear the sword for no reason. However, if there is something that is truly and egregiously opposed to reason, we don't have to ask ourselves, should I follow this law anyway? Because we know that it's not a law at all. It has escaped the bounds of God's eternal law and tried to run contrary to it. It's like a drop of water downstream that tries to defy the river. It simply can't. It doesn't do that. So when you have a very unreasonable, wicked set of laws, they're not to be followed. They're not real. They're not true. They have no binding force because God alone retains sovereignty over all authority. Anyhow, those are the three aspects of the law as they come to us. Again, they're all part of the one eternal law. So we should not view them as three different laws. They don't compete with each other in any way. In fact, they overlap. So the natural law would be a part of the eternal law. And of course, we only put into actual written or traditional positive law a very small amount, a part of what we reason should be morally good for us, the things that we can figure out. Obviously, if we had a perfect society on earth, we would be able to construct all of our positive laws as if, in perfect harmony with the eternal law of God. But we don't. And so we get as best as we can. We get as close as we can. At least in the good societies we do. In the bad ones, we clearly don't. Now, let's talk about how law interacts with freedom. The law of God, as we see it in the Old Testament, is flawless but incomplete. It is a shadow. It is a symbol of the new law of grace that we get in the New Testament. That has been fully revealed to us in Jesus Christ. So that means that we have now the fullness of the revelation of God's law. Remember how Jesus interacted with the old law. He said, not a little bit, nothing of this, no jot or tittle will pass away from the law. I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And what do you see in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount? You see, you've heard it said by men of old, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you're angry with your brother without cause, you're in danger of judgment. You've heard it said by men of old that you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you look at a woman to lust after her in your heart, you've committed adultery already. Well, what is Jesus doing there? He's not abrogating the old law. He's sharpening it. He's focusing it. He's bringing it to perfection. So when we think of the law of God, the law finds its perfect epitome in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, let's turn our attention to freedom. Most people think of freedom like this. If you have a choice, let's say, between A and B, post-Enlightenment thought located freedom as the ability to choose between alternatives. So they put freedom like right there, right in the crossroads of the choice between A and B. And anything that impinged upon that choice, anything that wounded that choice, even something like strong persuasion, would make the choice less free because you're pushing me towards either A or B. And if it's going to be my free choice, then each side has to be perfectly and equally open to me. Even my past virtues and vices shouldn't push me towards one way or the other. If I'm going to be fully free, I have to have total dominion over that point in time. That choice between A or B is my freedom. But St. Thomas Aquinas tells us very differently, and the Catholic Church tells us very differently. Freedom is not the ability to choose between alternatives. Freedom is the ability to choose the good. So it's not, let's say B is good here. So freedom is not just in that one moment of choice between choice one or choice two. Freedom is in desiring and voluntarily choosing what is good. That sounds like the opposite of freedom for some of us Americans, especially, right? Because we think of freedom as this almost divine ability to choose between two alternatives untouched by any other thing. But no, St. Augustine says that's not what freedom is. You know, St. Augustine had a problem with many sins. One of them was lust. The most prominent one was lust. He's very famous for that. He very famously prayed to the Lord in confessions. He recorded saying, Lord, give me purity of heart, but not yet. He so was in love with the sins of the flesh. But St. Augustine, reflecting on this later, says, I thought I was free, but I was never more a slave than when I was underneath my lust. I was a slave to my lust. My lower desires controlled me completely. I was almost like an animal. He says, I was sort of like a prisoner, locked inside the prison, but I was mad and I was proclaiming, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free, while at the same time locked in my chains. He uses that metaphor over and over and over in the book in the Confessions, but you can find it especially in chapter 3, book 1 of the Confessions. That metaphor of being in chains or being enslaved to sin. And that is, of course, the language that we get throughout Scripture. The Pauline metaphor for sin over and over is I was enslaved, I was under the flesh, I was in chains. So how could that be? I mean, after all, if freedom is the ability to choose left or right, good or bad, if it's right there in the middle, why do we have this long Christian tradition of people saying, no, you're not free if you choose the bad. You enslave yourself to sin. You enslave yourself to your lower desires. Your belly takes precedence over your head. St. Thomas Aquinas echoes that exact same thing. In the first part of the first part, question 83, article 1, he says that freedom is the ability to act perfectly towards the good. Now that's interesting. Let's compare these two visions of freedom to what we know now about the law. If freedom is simply the ability to choose between alternatives, then this vision of freedom would have to be limited by the law, right? Because I should be free to do anything, and the law comes in as a sort of downward force to say, you can go this far and no further. It comes in as a fence around my freedom. It collides with my freedom as its enemy, right? Whether it's God's law or the law of the land. The law is my freedom ends right here and can't go any further. That's why we can entertain these debates about freedom of speech or freedom of expression, freedom of association, and then wonder, well, like, where does that end? Do you really have freedom of speech? Can you really say anything? because we're using this understanding. It's a post-Enlightenment definition of freedom, and it is called the freedom of indifference by Tom Howard and by others. The freedom of indifference. Indifference meaning you're not tilted one way or the other. You're sort of perfectly in the middle. You're not slanted. You're indifferent. So that freedom of indifference does not come to us from Jesus Christ. It is not echoed in St. Thomas Aquinas. It is not in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Why is it so prominent here? Well, it's a post-Enlightenment invention. People like Voltaire, people like Locke, people like Descartes are responsible for ensconcing that definition of freedom into all of our minds so that we think of ourselves sort of like gods, able to choose between good and evil perfectly and evenly. And that is freedom. And that equals good. Like that ability in and of itself is already good. But no, Augustine and Thomas both tell us, no, that is not freedom at all. They describe a freedom not of indifference, but for excellence or perfection. Perfection here not meaning like I never make a mistake, but perfection meaning like I'm going towards that thing that makes me whole, that thing that perfects me in the way that an oak tree perfects an acorn or an adult deer perfects a fawn, right? Like you're moving towards that thing that you're supposed to be. In this vision of freedom, the law does not push me down. It doesn't fence me in. It enables my freedom. How does it do that? By directing me towards the good. By leading me towards what is good, it enables my freedom. So rather than become an enemy to the law and freedom in heaven are one thing. Because there is only one rationality. There's only one goodness. There's only one truth. To choose against the truth is an oxymoron. That's why the rebellion of the devil and his angels is so obviously a flight into ruin. That's why the wages of sin is death. Because the moment one chooses to flee from God, and yes, you do have that ability. You do have choice, but choice and freedom aren't the same thing. The moment one chooses to flee from God, it's like light trying to flee from the sun. You can't do that. The only thing outside of God is nothingness. The only thing outside of the truth is falsity, and falsity is not being at all, non-being, non-existence. In other words, the wages of sin is death. So this new relation to the law of understanding our freedom as the ability to choose what is good, it produces within us also this new relation within ourselves, between each other as human beings and to God. We're not sort of like these neutral beings just weighing one thing or the other, sitting atop a mountain like a god, but rather we're trying to exact our perfection. We're trying to move towards our final end. And that's what St. Thomas Aquinas means when he says the ability to act perfectly towards the good. That's what true freedom is. And by the way, we know this. Just take a look at the lives of the people around you. The people who live in sin, that quote unquote do whatever they want. You do you, man, and I'll do me. Do they seem profoundly free to you? Are they really the masters of the universe that they proclaim themselves to be? Or are they caught? Do you see them repeating the same old sins over and over? And maybe they tell you they don't care, but do you see a little look of guilt behind their eyes? Do you see their lives being destroyed, even if they don't feel guilty about these things? Do you see their lives being destroyed? Do you see them able to look themselves in the mirror and truly confront who they are? Or do you see something else? And even the worst Christian, even the Christian who falls down 7 times a day, do you see them different? Do you see them repenting of sin, coming closer to the Lord, saying, man, I messed up again. I'm going to try and do better in the future. God, all my hope is in you. Jesus, I trust in you. Does that person have a different demeanor? Do they seem more free to you? It's like, as Americans, after the Enlightenment, it's like as Americans and as Westerners, we just sort of like, we think that in order to be free, in order to flourish, we have to be in control of everything. And reason and faith have to be ripped apart. But that's not the case at all. We're never less in control of ourselves than when we're committing a sin. Again, think of Augustine. He was in, I was a slave to my sin. He says, I rejoiced even while I was in chains because I was also in darkness. In other words, like, I didn't admit that I was chained. So the only thing that I have left is to say that I'm free. Consider the character of the devil in Milton's Paradise Lost. Just read it right there in that first book. The very famous line, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. You know, he even says slightly before that, the mind can make heaven a hell and hell a heaven. What is he doing? The devil is asserting like this vision of freedom where he can do anything. He could even be happy in hell. Yeah, no, it's better that I'm in hell because at least here I'll be a king. You, the reader, are supposed to look at him like boiling in a lake of fire and go, that's not true. That's not true. And we should also do it to each other. We should say, yeah, you think that you're free. You're proclaiming yourself a deity, a reigner, a king in hell. That's nothing. There is nothing there. There's dust and ashes. There's fire and brimstone. Life is only in God. And what does Jesus say? He who seeks to save his own life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will gain it. You are never more yourself than when you are giving your actions, giving your life, using your freedom to choose what is good, using your choice to orient yourself towards that final end. You're never more you when you do that. How many times do we have to go through this cycle where people abandon what the Catholic Church has taught and then they sort of like fall into misery and then they find it out for themselves? I mean, they've got these things going now where men are like trying to be off of pornography and the sins that come with that. And then when they get off a little bit of the sin, they sort of go like, oh, wow, this is actually really nice. I heard one guy say, I'm like me with extra me sauce or something. Like, yeah, of course you are. Because when we give ourselves to God, he gives himself to us and we have life. We have true freedom. We are really flourishing. One of the best metaphors I've ever seen for this is this. Tom Howard in Chants of the Dance considers the metaphor of a piano. Anybody out there playing piano knows that the moment you sit down at a piano, especially in public, if there's anyone around who doesn't know how to play the piano, or even someone around who's just sort of like ready to goof off, they're going to come up to you and stand next to you while you're sort of playing it, and they'll stand next to you and go, just for a second, and then what do? And they just start hitting random keys, right? They love to do it. Even adults, like not just little children. They'll just start playing random keys. Or they'll play the one song that they know, and then, boom, they'll start playing random stuff. Now, which one of the two of you is more free? Is the pianist more free or the amateur? Is the master more free on the piano to play what he wants? Or is the child more free? Now, the child is doing literally, indifferently, whatever he or she wants. The amateur, the punk, is doing whatever they want. They're smacking the keys. They can even use their face. Smack the keys of the piano. They can do whatever. But are they free? Can they play the Moonlight Sonata with perfect grace? Can they even write their own songs in the way that they want? Can they express themselves the way that they want on the piano? No way. So Howard says, I may flog the keys as hard as I please, but I am not free for one moment. It doesn't for one moment equal that beautiful, perfect freedom of the musician who actually follows the very many rules, the very many laws of music. This holds true across all fields of life. Take the athlete. Athletes don't get to do whatever they want, not only when they're out there on the field, but in practice. Not only in practice, but just throughout their entire life. If you want to be a master at a sport, you can't just live however you want the rest of the time and then on the field or on the court take on a totally new persona. It doesn't work like that. You have to follow a very specific regimen. But who is more free on the basketball court than an expert player? Who is more free to play tennis than an expert? They're on a totally different level. And they're not sitting there rehearsing the laws in their mind. Every shot that they take or every serve they return, they're not doing that. They know the law becomes part of them. It becomes encoded into what they do, and they rejoice in it. Psalm 119, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. It's an entire psalm. There are many, many psalms about how beautiful and wonderful the law is. Can you imagine a high schooler singing a song about how beautiful and wonderful all the rules are? It doesn't happen very often. Because most often we think of freedom like this, and we think of rules as like this, and they're clashing with us all the time. That's not true. It's a terrible vision of what freedom is. Freedom is the ability to choose the good, the ability to act perfectly towards one's final end. And when we run towards God, we are free. And his law is not burdensome to us, but we experience it as a joy. It is not written on tablets of stone, but on our hearts. St. Augustine is never more happy than in that famous scene in the Confessions when he wants to become a Christian. He knows that's the truth after this arduous and long journey through all these other philosophies of Platonism and Manichaeism. He's been all over. He's been to Rome. He's got this girlfriend with whom he has a child. He wants to convert to Christianity, but he feels that he can't He doesn't really want to give up. He says, almost at that moment, I heard all these girls calling out to me, these beautiful women saying, is this really it? Augustine, is that the last time? It's so great. Augustine was this like mammoth, just absolutely giant thinker, this total intellectual. And he's just pinned down by this one very fleshly, very common thing. And that's lust, right? Like he wants to escape, but he can't. And then he runs and he hears this voice. Take it and read it. He finds sitting next to him a copy of, I think, the book of Romans, and he takes it up and he reads something like putting away all licentiousness and lustfulness, etc. He's freed at that moment to become a Christian. He's so happy. And of course, that's what makes him the saint that he is for the rest of his life, because he finally realizes that he's been loving things that are not worthy of his love, or in a way that's not worthy of his love. He's been loving the creation and not the creator. He's been loving the means, but not the end. And now once he can see his way to the end, he loves all things properly arrayed. He loves all things only in light of the truth, the final end, which is God, the highest good. And so he joyfully lets go of his carnal pleasures to chase after God. So I'm not trying to talk anybody into, hey, the rules are really good now, and do your homework and make sure you stand up straight and have good I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to help you to see that this very understanding of freedom is a diabolical lie. It has been used to make us think that the law is against us, or that it at least limits us. It even works on Christians, where we think like, oh, well, guess I can't really go out with you guys anymore. Yeah, I'm trying to live the good life. I'm trying to go straight. I mean, maybe we'll feel like that at some point, but it's like, ultimately what you're going for is, I don't want to do that. I'm not attracted to that particular lifestyle because that's not good for me. It's not what God wants for me, and it's not what I want for myself. So I rejoice. Yes, you can rejoice in Mass. You can rejoice before the Lord, even in difficult circumstances, of course. Why? Because you have true freedom. The grace of God has worked in your heart, and you have said yes to that grace. And so you've moved towards your final end. So these things are important to understand. They're important to understand in relationship to each other, but they're also important to understand in our relations with each other, and most importantly, our relationship to God, who is not as like a rule giver who's up there sort of arbitrarily limiting us. He's rather the creator of the universe, whose perfect reason knows the right answer to everything and wants us greatly to become part of his joy, part of his beatitude, wants us to return to him. One last analogy, and then I'm done. Every person who has children starts to understand this really quickly. And perhaps the reason that we've stopped understanding this is connected to the reason that we've had less or fewer children. I don't know. But every father knows this. Like, yes, at some point I have to have my son, he's reaching for the electrical socket. I have to say, no, the rule is you don't touch that, obviously. And he's going to experience that perhaps as contrary to his own will. And he's going to go, well, I want to touch it. What if I want to? And then I might have to bring in a consequence. Who knows? But ultimately, I don't want to have to be following my son around for the rest of his life saying, don't stick your finger in electrical sockets, do I? I want him to understand my rules. And all of us who have been sons and daughters who have grown up to understand why our parents did the things that they did, we've realized that, oh, they were actually acting in love towards us. That's precisely what is true here. Your heavenly Father wants you to choose what is good at all times, and you will never be freer. There will be no angels shoving you in one direction, nor will there be demons shoving you in one direction. It is God's reasonable plan for the whole world that all things should tend towards the good. And so when you participate in that rather than struggling against it, you experience it as joy. Just like when you look back at the things that your father and your mother have done for you, you go, oh yeah, that actually would have been for my betterment. I should probably have listened to them. Sorry about that. So we must revise our definition of freedom. We must revise our understanding of freedom. It is not limited by the law. It is not the enemy of the law. It's enabled by the law. It's guided by it. This generation has never been more depressed, more anxious, more lost, more purposeless, because it turns out that law is the same thing as direction. So nobody knows what to do. Everybody's depressed and anxious because who wouldn't be? I would be sad and anxious if I had no idea what to do with myself. So everyone's depressed and anxious because they think of law, they think of rules as restrictions on them and something to be fought against. And it's sort of like, yeah, you do your own thing, man, I'll do my own thing. And then everyone's doing their own thing ever since what? The baby boomers? And everyone's just sort of like doing their own thing. We throw morality out the window and all of a sudden nobody's happy anymore. St. Thomas Aquinas wouldn't be surprised by that at all. In fact, he would have said, that's exactly what will happen because beatitude and God are one. It's our final end. That's what we're moving towards. So we have to start thinking of our freedom as not the ability to make some arbitrary choice, but the actualization of what God wants for us in our lives. And that leads to joy.